Consequences of the explosion of the Kakhovskaya HPP. How high will the water rise and how long will the flood last? Scientific calculations show that the wave after the explosion of the Kakhovskaya HPP by the Russians will descend within 2 days. The maximum height of the water rise will be 3 meters. This was announced by Yevgeny Korzhov, senior researcher at the Kherson State Agrarian and Economic University. As the scientist noted, the area of flooding of the coastal strip will be 100 square kilometers. The affected area is much larger, he said, noting that about 500 square kilometers will flood in the lower Dnieper. According to him, the affected area also includes the area of the Kakhovsky Reservoir, which after the water meltdown will become the center of environmental problems for decades. In addition, the Dnepropetrovsk estuary will suffer. The catastrophe begins with the Kakhovsky Reservoir. All contaminated water with a little rain will drain into the lower reaches of the Dnieper and into the estuary, Korzhov said. Calculations show that the convergence of the first wave of flooding is expected within the next 2 days. That is, today or tomorrow may still be the highest level, Korzhov explained. According to him, then the water level will gradually decrease. He also expressed doubts that the Kakhovskaya HPP, which had been under construction for many years, would be able to be restored quickly in the current conditions, since this requires very significant investments of labor and financial resources.
Russia has undermined the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant, according to the Ukrainian authorities, under the threat of flooding settlements. We'll tell you about the latest news in the next 15 minutes. So, the main topic is the undermining of the dam of the Kakhovskaya HPP of the Kherson region. In these frames, the consequences are filmed from a drone. The water is moving in a huge stream. According to Kiev's estimates, the HPP has been completely destroyed and cannot be restored. About a dozen settlements are flooded. The water has reached Kherson itself. Evacuation is taking place in the city and in neighboring villages. Kiev blamed Moscow for the attack and called it a terrorist act, and the Kremlin has traditionally accused Ukraine of sabotage. The hydroelectric power station is located near the town of Novaya Kakhovka, temporarily occupied in Russia. It was of strategic importance and connected the right and left banks of the Dnieper. Our correspondents will tell you all the details of what happened. Only on the right bank of the Dnieper, due to the explosion of the dam, about 16,000 people were in the critical zone. According to Kiev's estimates, the water level should reach its maximum level around noon. Local authorities report that the evacuation of residents is complicated by the fact that the roads are already partially washed out. What happened in the first minutes after the dam was blown up? See our material. The first reports of the explosion of the Kakhovskaya HPP appeared this night. The station is located on the territory not controlled by Kiev. This is the left bank of the Kherson region. The footage shows that the 3-kilometer dam has been seriously damaged since Soviet times on the Dnieper River. Parts of the structure are washed away by water flows. The APU accused Russia of blowing up the dam and called it an act of terror. Since the morning, the legitimate authorities of the region have been calling for evacuation. The occupation authorities were in no hurry to evacuate people in the morning. Information about the explosion was called nonsense. Vladimir Leontiev, the mayor of Novaya Kakhovka, who was appointed by Moscow, commenting on the situation for the Russian state agency RA Novosti, repeated 3 times, "Everything is fine." On the right bank, according to the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, more than 700 residents were taken out of the coastal areas of Novaya Kakhovka. This is the left bank. The occupation authorities evacuated residents from 300 houses, where the water rose by more than 10 meters. And this is what the central square looks like, where the city council is located. Swans are swimming near the House of Culture. The water has already reached 8 settlements of the Kherson region, including the regional center. About 80 cities and towns may be flooded, according to the Ukrainian government. On the Dnieper Islands, the water rose to the roofs of private houses. The police are trying to help not only to get people out, but also to get animals out of the water. An emergency meeting of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine was held in Kiev in the morning due to the rush of the Kakhovskaya HPP. It was created by President Vladimir Zelensky.
Today, at a meeting of the NSDC, Vladimir Zelensky was lent that about 80 settlements in the flooding zone. Zelensky ordered the evacuation of high settlements. The execution of the decree began already in the morning. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian energy industry said that the undermining of the hydroelectric power plant would not affect the energy system of Ukraine in any way, because allegedly they had not received any energy for a long time. In Ukhrhydroenergo, this is the structure that controls all Ukrainian hydroelectric power plants. They said that the gas was completely destroyed, but nevertheless in the operational command south, this is a military structure. They said that the dam was still not completely destroyed and would support the restoration. The Ukrainian intelligence service said that the explosion was completely controlled. It had been planned for a long time. Let me remind you that even during the previous counteroffensive of the Ukrainian military on Kherson and during the occupation of Kherson, it was also about the possible undermining of the dam by the Russian army. Then the Ukrainian intelligence even said that the dam was mined, but then everything went well. In the Nikolaev administration, the head of the Nikolaev administration, Mr. Kim, said that most likely the explosion was stronger than expected by the Russian military, the occupation authorities, because according to the data received from the other side, from the enemy, they did not expect such large-scale consequences, since, in fact, the Crimean Peninsula is now left without water, which was powered by a local reservoir, as well as water problems began in Crimea. And what was all this done for? What was it served for? Yes, we explained it today in the operational command of the UCA. It explains everything very simply. In order to disrupt the offensive of the Ukrainian military, it was served so that the Ukrainian military could not force the Dnieper. The Dnieper is so wide, so big that it is quite problematic to force it. Military experts and local bloggers are talking about the same version. As the Yuka offensive will continue, they said that nothing will stop this end of the offensive.
The Kremlin said about an hour ago that there was, I quote, a deliberate sabotage of the Ukrainian country at the Kakhovskaya HPP. One of the goals, according to the press secretary of the Russian president, is to deprive Crimea of water. Dmitry Peskov also told reporters that Moscow strongly rejects the accusations of undermining the Kakhovskaya HPP. The Russian Defense Ministry has not yet commented on the destruction of the dam. At the same time, the so-called head of the occupied districts of the Kherson region, Vladimir Salda, appointed by Moscow, claims that it was allegedly the Ukrainian military who launched a missile attack on the Kakhovskaya HPP in order, I quote, to distract attention from the failures of counteroffensives. The occupation authorities initially downplayed the scale of the disaster and stated that the volume of water that got into the Dnieper was uncritical. This allegedly will not prevent the Russian military from maintaining its positions on the left bank. Although, if you look at the map, the first line of defense of the Russian troops on the left bank of the Dnieper falls under the flooding. A few hours after the destruction of the plates, Russian officials in the occupied territories of Ukraine still announced the evacuation of people in the area of Novaya Kakhovka and introduced a state of emergency there. The occupation authorities of the city said that residents were allegedly being taken out by buses. Officials appointed by Moscow and officials believe that 14 settlements, in which about 22,000 people live, fall into the flooding zone. The Russian authorities in the annexed Crimea also state that the peninsula's water supply will not be affected in any way due to the break of the dam. Dmitry Peskov claims that there is a margin of safety in Crimea to provide water at the expense of local reservoirs. At the same time, Kiev notes that the undermining of the hydroelectric power plant will primarily have consequences for the Crimea. In the operational command, the South states that the peninsula may remain without water for years. The president of Ukraine has the same opinion at all. Ukraine intends to convene an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council due to the undermining of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant. This was announced by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Dmitry Kuleba. In turn, in the European Union, the dam was called a war crime, for which Russia will answer. Perhaps, traditionally, the Eastern European Union is the fastest in reaction, advocating the most powerful support for Ukraine and condemning Russia in the strongest possible way. In particular, the Estonian president called the dams another terrorist act threatening thousands of peaceful Ukrainians. They believe that he will become another item in the list of charges brought by a Moscow criminal in power. I quoted this accordingly. The president of Latvia also called Russia a terrorist state, urging to stop it, strengthen support for Ukraine, and bring war criminals to justice. There was a moment of Lithuania. He emphasized the need for Ukraine to win on the battlefield because, quote, only the forces will stop the terrorists. And his Czech counterpart equated the attack on the dam with the use of weapons of mass destruction. The unprecedented attack on the Kakhovskaya HPP shocked the president of the European Council. He said that this is definitely a war crime, promised responsibility for Russia, offered assistance to the flooded Ukrainian territories, and intends to bring this topic up for discussion at the next summit of EU leaders, which, as you know, will be held at the end of this month. The destruction of the dam was called criminal and reckless by one from the Council of Europe, of which Russia ceased to be a part after the invasion of Ukraine. The best thing Russia, can do now is to withdraw her troops, a top British diplomat wrote to the witness. In turn, commenting on the risks of flooding of Ukrainian territories, said that it was too early to give a meaningful assessment of the details, but it was Russia's attack on Ukraine that, in his opinion, was the root cause of the disaster. Probably the largest, if we talk about its technogenic nature, in Europe over the past decade. I believe the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, he did not directly accuse Russia of what happened and did not escape, limiting himself to the fact that there are, in his opinion, signs of Russian involvement and emphasizing the importance of supporting Ukraine. The NATO Secretary General called the explosion of the dam an outrageous act, said, once again demonstrates the brutality of the Russian war against Ukraine. Ukraine may adjust its plans for a counteroffensive due to the undermining of the Kakhovskaya HPP. This was reported by the presidential administration of Ukraine. Let me remind you that the armed forces of Ukraine have already made a statement that the undermining of the Kakhovskaya HPP will not stop the planned counteroffensive.
And that's it for me. If you liked this video, don't forget to rate it, subscribe to the channel and click on the bell. For me, your activity, this is the best reward. Thank you for your attention. See you soon.